Australia built a station wagon that came with a supercharged 6.2-litre V8 that's enough power to embarrass sports cars while still carrying the kids to school. Another became the family car of an entire generation, hauling camping gear, dogs, surfboards, and half of Australia across the country. And one looked so right, sitting in an Australian driveway, that decades later, people still stop and stare when they see one. These weren't just wagons, they were part of Australian life, packed with families and memories. Some were tough, some were beautiful, and some were absolute weapons. Welcome to the 15 greatest Australian station wagons ever made. This Toyota wagon earned its place on this list not through drama, but through something quietly remarkable. It was built at Toyota's Altona plant in Victoria, proving that Australian manufacturing could produce something beyond the Holden and Ford duopoly that had defined local industry for decades. The credentials were straightforward and genuinely impressive. Bulletproof reliability, a well-finished interior, smooth power from the 2.2-litre four-cylinder, and the kind of dependability that earned Toyota its global reputation. As a family wagon, it delivered on every practical promise without complaint. It may not set pulses racing, but this Camry wagon represents something important: the broadening of Australian manufacturing beyond the twin giants. In a list defined by Holdens and Fords, that distinction matters more than any muscle car badge. Before the great Australian wagon story could be written, someone had to start it. The Holden FE Special Station Sedan did exactly that. Arriving in 1956 as one of the earliest factory-built Holden wagons and establishing the template that Australian families would follow for the next 50 years. The FE's body was practical and well-proportioned, carrying the same clean lines as the sedan while adding the load-carrying capability that young, growing Australian families needed. It was honest, unfussy, and built for a country that expected its cars to work as hard as the people driving them. Without the FE Station Sedan, there is no HQ Kingswood, no VT Commodore wagon, no Sport Wagon Dynasty. Every entry on this list owes something to this modest but genuinely important pioneer. The FE started the story, but it gets considerably more interesting from here. Coming up, one of the most underrated Chrysler wagons ever built, and a locally built family wagon that proved Holden and Ford weren't the only ones who understood Australia. The Chrysler CM Valiant Regal wagon arrived as the curtain was falling on the great Australian large wagon era, and it played its final act with real dignity. Big, simple, rear-wheel drive, and powered by Chrysler Australia's legendary Hemi 6. It was everything a working Australian family needed in the late 1970s. The Regal trim elevated the CM above mere utility. Well appointed for the era, it delivered genuine comfort across the long distances Australians actually drove. The spacious cabin and enormous load area made it a proper all-rounder in a market that rewarded practicality above all else. As one of the last Valiant wagons to roll out of Tonsley Park, the CM Regal carries the weight of an era, the final, unhurried chapter of a distinctly Australian automotive story. The Mitsubishi Magna wagon arrived in 1985 and challenged how Australian families thought about the large family wagon. Front-wheel drive, a transverse engine, and dramatically better fuel economy than the old rear-drive giants. The Magna was modern in ways the established players hadn't caught up to yet. Through successive generations and the premium Verada badge, the formula was continuously refined. The interior grew more comfortable, the engines more capable, the overall package more polished, all while maintaining the practical wagon body that Australian families relied on for school runs, road trips, and everything in between. For 20 years, the Magna and Verada wagon quietly transported families across the country. Not glamorous, but dependable, modern, and far more important to the Australian wagon story than it usually gets credit for. So the list has moved from early Holden history to the outsiders that shook up the formula. But now we get back to the big Aussie bruisers, starting with a Falcon wagon that was far better than its reputation, and another that became a true 1980s workhorse. The Ford AU Falcon sedan is one of the most controversial cars in Australian history, but the wagon never deserved to share that reputation. Where the AU sedan's polarizing styling created problems, the wagon's extended roofline gave the design proportion and purpose that worked. The longer format suited the AU in ways the sedan never managed. Mechanically, the AU delivered what Falcon buyers expected: a strong inline-six rear-wheel drive, generous interior space, and the capability that made the Falcon badge trusted for decades. The ride was comfortable, the practicality genuine, and the towing capacity impressive. The AU Falcon wagon never got the credit it deserved, largely because of the sedan it shared a name with. Strip away the controversy and what remains is a large, capable, properly useful Australian family wagon. If you are enjoying watching this episode, subscribe if you want. The Ford XF Falcon wagon is one of those cars that built Australia. Simple, honest, and comprehensively practical, it showed up in paddocks, school car parks, and construction sites with the same effortless reliability, working through the 1980s without complaint or drama. The 4.1-litre inline-six was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Smooth enough for highway cruising, durable enough for outback work, and economical enough for a family on a budget. The wagon body added generous load capacity and three-row seating that made it a genuine do-everything vehicle when doing everything was what Australian families required. Decades later, the XF Falcon wagon sits at the heart of Australian automotive nostalgia. Almost everyone of a certain age remembers one, and the survivors still earn genuine respect wherever they go. That covers two of Ford's most honest family haulers. Next, Holden steps into the modern era with one of its best big wagons, before Ford answers with the final great chapter of the Falcon wagon story. The Holden VT Commodore wagon was the moment Holden proved it could build a modern Australian family wagon worthy of the new century. The new platform brought European influence to ride and handling, a dramatically improved interior, and a level of refinement that earlier Commodore wagons had always been reaching for without quite achieving. Available with the 3.8-litre V6 or the 5.0-litre V8, the VT gave families genuine choice: economy and smoothness, or outright performance and towing muscle. The wagon body was spacious, well-resolved, and properly practical in a way that made the daily school run and the annual road trip equally manageable. The VT Commodore wagon arrived and felt like a genuine step forward, a large rear-wheel drive Australian wagon that had absolutely nothing to apologize for. The Ford BA and BF Falcon wagons represent the peak of the Falcon wagon story, the point at which Ford Australia had refined the formula so thoroughly that the result was one of the finest large rear-drive wagons the world had seen at that price. The Barra inline-six was the centerpiece, smooth, torquey, brilliantly refined, and available in naturally aspirated and turbocharged forms that transformed the wagon from family workhorse into something far more compelling. The chassis handled Australian roads with assurance, the interior was genuinely comfortable, and the load area was as useful as anything on the market. When Australians mourn the end of locally built cars, it is often the BA and BF Falcon wagon they think of, a vehicle that did everything right, almost without effort. Now we are into the serious stuff, the wagons that had style, presence, and proper classic appeal. First, a Chrysler that deserves way more love, then a Holden that might be one of the prettiest wagons Australia ever built. The Chrysler VE Valiant Safari wagon is one of Australian automotive history's most unjustly overlooked vehicles. In the late 1960s, it offered everything a large family could want: genuine spaciousness, smooth power from Chrysler's 225 Slant 6, and V8 availability for buyers who wanted extra muscle. The Safari name suited it perfectly. The long, low roofline, the clean flanks, and the wide rear door gave it a presence most wagons of the era completely lacked. It looked good, rode well, and carried its passengers in real comfort across the distances that defined Australian family life. Chrysler Australia produced some genuinely excellent vehicles, and the VE Valiant Safari stands among the best of them, underrated then and undeservedly forgotten now. The Holden EH Premier Station Sedan is one of the most beautiful Australian wagons ever built, and beauty is not a quality that wagons get credited with nearly often enough. The EH's clean lines, crisp detailing, and perfectly proportioned roofline made the station sedan not just a practical choice, but a genuinely attractive one. In the early 1960s, it sat at the top of the Holden range, and the station sedan brought that prestige to the wagon body. The chrome trim, considered detailing, and refined interior made it a premium product in an era when premium meant something earned rather than marketing-led. It remains one of the most evocative wagons in Australian history, a car that captured a specific golden moment in the story of how Australia travelled. From here, the list gets harder to argue with. A sharp-looking Falcon brings early 70s style, then Holden completely reinvents the wagon for a new generation. The Ford XY Falcon Fairmont wagon combined two things that don't always find each other: genuine visual presence and genuine everyday practicality. The XY's muscular front end, clean flanks, and confident stance translated beautifully into wagon form, purposeful and attractive from every angle without sacrificing a single liter of boot space. The Fairmont trim elevated the experience significantly. A more refined interior, additional equipment, and a level of comfort that made long family journeys far more pleasant than the Spartan alternatives of the era. Paired with the inline 6 or the optional V8, it was as capable as it was handsome. The XY Fairmont wagon sits at a perfect intersection of style and function that Australian cars rarely managed so effortlessly, and deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. By 2008, the SUV had conquered the Australian new car market, and the traditional large wagon was being written off as a relic. Then Holden unveiled the VE Commodore Sport Wagon, and suddenly the large Australian rear-drive wagon had a future, because this one was genuinely, undeniably, compellingly stylish. The Sport Wagon's sloping roofline, sculpted flanks, and wide rear end gave it a visual drama that no Australian wagon had previously managed. Available with V6 and V8 engines, rear-wheel drive as standard, and a level of equipment that made it genuinely premium, it punched directly at the SUVs stealing its customers and made a compelling case for staying low. The VE Sport Wagon didn't just save the Australian wagon, it reimagined it, and for a while it actually worked. Now, the final three. This is where the family wagon stops being just practical and starts becoming ridiculous. One modern Holden masterpiece, one HSV monster, and then the old-school icon that defines the whole breed. This Holden Redline Sport Wagon is as close to perfection as a production Australian car ever got. A 6.2-litre LS3 V8, rear-wheel drive, a 6-speed automatic, and a full-sized wagon body with room for 5 adults and everything needed for a week away. This was not a compromise. This was a statement that the Australian wagon could compete with the finest performance estates in the world on its own terms at a fraction of the price. The suspension was sorted, the brakes were serious, and the exhaust note at full throttle was simply extraordinary. When the last one rolled off the Elizabeth line in 2017, Australia lost something irreplaceable. The Redline Sport Wagon proved that local manufacturing, given real commitment, could produce something genuinely world-class. If the Redline was as good as a production Australian wagon got, this one was what happened when engineers stopped worrying about constraints. a supercharged 6.2-liter LSA V8 producing 560 horsepower in a wagon, one of the most extraordinary vehicles this country has ever produced. The Tourer body made the performance even more absurd. You could carry the family, load the boot, drive sensibly to school, and then, on an empty highway, unleash something genuinely frightening. The chassis kept up, the brakes kept up, the sound was magnificent. A handful of performance wagons in the world operate at this level. This one is one of them, and it was built right here in Australia. This is it, the most iconic Australian wagon ever built. The vehicle that defines what the Australian family station wagon actually was. The HQ Kingswood wagon wasn't the fastest or the most refined entry on this list. It was something far more valuable. It was everywhere. In the early 1970s, the HQ Kingswood wagon was the centerpiece of Australian family life. Packed with children, camping gear, surfboards and dogs, it covered highways, dirt tracks and suburban streets with a simple, durable competence that asked nothing beyond basic maintenance. The HQ was honest, enormous and endlessly practical. 5 decades on, the sight of one, patinated, loaded up, ready to go, still produces a reaction in Australians that no modern technology can replicate. The wagon by which all others are measured. And that is what made Aussie wagons special. They were not just practical family cars, and they were not built to be precious collectibles. They were built to be used, loaded with kids, dogs, tools, luggage, camping gear, and everything else Australian life could throw at them. Some were simple, some were stylish, and some were completely ridiculous, but they all proved that a wagon could still have character. These were the cars people grew up in, went on holidays in, worked out of, and remembered decades later. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If I made any mistake, feel free to type it in the comments. If you could do me a favor and click subscribe, I would be very grateful. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.